And we're live. Hi, everyone. Sydney here, back in the living room, and I'm not alone this time. I have a guest with me. He is the host of the Liberty Beat podcast, available at libertybeat.ca. Please help me welcome Daniel Benoit. How's it going, Dan?
It's great to be talking to you again.
Yes. So we're going to talk about on the issue of net neutrality. So let's begin. I've admitted that I am a total noob on this issue. So give us a little bit of about your background. Why should we listen to you?
So I actually worked for an ISP. It was a small competitive one for at least 5 years. So my duties were, I wasn't just in the call center. I actually maintained the network infrastructure as well as the server infrastructure. And subsequent to that, I worked for another ISP that was much larger. And I only did the servers there, so I didn't do as much of the network side. I had to work with lobbyists who would lobby the CRTC. So I'm Canadian, and the CRTC is kind of our equivalent to the FCC. So I know that a lot of the buzz right now is about the FCC, but kind of my wheelhouse is the CRTC. It doesn't necessarily mean that I am an expert in all the legal side of things, but I can say that I am an expert as far as the way that networks are configured and how they operate and so on.
Excellent. So I'm assuming that most of the people watching this already know, but let's start with the basics. Can you explain to us what is net neutrality?
So people have an expectation that when they send out information onto the internet or when they receive information from the internet, that information is going to go the same speed no matter what the content of the information or no matter where the destination of the information is, that people are just going, that the network itself is just going to treat the information the same regardless of what's inside of it, that they're just going to be stupid about it. It's just if they hear it in one ear, then it comes out the other. It is precisely unchanged, and everything is given equality as far as the ISP is concerned. And I think that this is a laudable thing to desire, but there has been a recent push to try and enshrine that in regulatory law, which is interesting. I can go into any of the specific details about
yeah, please.
Effects that might have.
From to make sure that I understand what you're saying, it's like it's basically zeros and ones that are treated indiscriminately, maybe clustered into 8-bit bytes, but the idea is, whatever happens is passed along regardless of anything.
Yeah, more or less. So there's different types of things that you do on the internet. Like you can be watching a video, you can be viewing a website, and actually, I should mention another piece of work history I had. I worked for a company that created equipment that is able to discriminate between different types of traffic. So it's able to tell the difference between whether you're viewing a movie or you're viewing a website, or which website, or in some cases, what precisely you're doing.
Wow.
And to make decisions inside this little box inside the data center, to make decisions about how things are routed and how fast things are going. So essentially, I worked for one of the companies that is kind of the nightmare scenario that people have been.
Yeah, in principle, it's kind of obvious that it's a solvable problem to detect, let's say, the difference between video streaming like we're doing now, or some HTML web page on some WordPress blog. But I hadn't considered the possibility of doing it at the hardware level.
Oh yeah, and the equipment actually can take the information that it learns and throw it into a database, and then the billing system of the company can go and extract information from that database and give you a separate charge based on the various things you're doing. So they could charge you a certain amount per byte for video traffic, and they can charge you a certain different rate per byte for your web browsing. They could even exclude certain sites like Facebook's for free because we have a deal with Facebook. Yeah, all of this nightmare scenario stuff that the net neutrality proponents are talking about, they're absolutely real, and they could potentially happen, and in fact, it seems to be kind of the way things are going.
So there is
Now,
someone somewhere with a master switch who could just flick it on and enable that two-speed internet, dun 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 kind of stuff.
it's more complicated than that, but I will say that yes, there are boxes, there are physical machines that are being developed that are going in between various network connections, and inside the brains of these systems is the capability to do the sort of thing that people are talking about. These boxes exist. They're being tested. They're eagerly trying to figure out ways on these terrible roads where we're kind of manipulated into paying more than we otherwise would be. There was I forget what the terminology was that they were using when they brought us in on their marketing meetings to talk about it. I think it was like or something like that. There was some buzzword about how we need to figure out psychologically manipulating ways to squeeze as much as we possibly can from any given customer by exploiting, say, oh, they use mostly Facebook, so why not give them a really expensive deal, but it gives Facebook for free, and people will be more likely to accept that, not realizing that, in fact, when they look at their bill at the end of the month, it's actually going to be higher because all the various things they went to that weren't Facebook out the nose.
That is a little scary. Actually, it's a lot scary, and that is it ties into a point that I have planned for discussion today anyway. But I would like to follow the outline that I have written here on my notes, and I think it segues nicely into my question: how does net neutrality help big corporations, the big evil corporations? How does net neutrality help them?
So before the net neutrality regulations were proposed, by and large, the regulatory bodies that control the telephone network and the cable network that the internet goes through, they were largely just controlling the medium, the physical medium themselves, essentially the connection between their data center. That with the introduction of this net neutrality stuff, they actually want to extend that regulatory power from the just the connection to the contents of the connection itself. So essentially, what's being proposed here is that we have bureaucrats looking over the shoulders of people like me, engineers, who want to maintain these networks and to make sure that everything that they do is being done in the interest of equality and fairness. Needless to say, this is an expense upon the companies, and I worked for a very small ISP, so I know the destructive power that comes with an additional regulatory expense. We were always on pins and needles. We were always just one bad decision by the CRTC away from all of us having to pack up our desks and go home, because we were completely dependent upon their good graces to continue to exist. If they decided to introduce some extra burdens upon us, that would be it. Our profit margin would be gone, and so would we. And
Right, and
trust me,
I'm sorry
the big guys, they were advocating this.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, because I feel there's a tiny part of that seemed important that kind of flew over my head. So if I understand correctly, it's all about increasing regulatory costs because with net neutrality. With net neutrality, let's pretend we're in America and say FCC, they can regulate the content of the packets and not just the actual hardware. Am I understanding this right?
So they do, in some cases, regulate the content of what you're doing. Like they'll do a piracy site blockades and stuff like that. But it's a very light touch, at least so far. And indeed, the net neutrality thing, although it is unprecedented in how intrusive it is on regulating the actual stuff that's going back and forth across the lines, it isn't that bad. It's still
Okay.
I mean, it's just another stepping stone toward them being able to control exactly how the internet is routed, how it's strung together, how it's configured.
Okay, and here's the part, and I gotta say, I really enjoy being a total noob on this issue, but the part that's confusing me is how does net neutrality increase the costs of, let's say, complying with regulation, or how does it increase the amount of control the FCC has over our navigation on the web when
Okay.
we're just supposed to treat all data indiscriminately? So it's kind of like a flat tax as opposed to a progressive layer income tax or whatever. So how
I
does
get what you're saying.
simplifying how the packets are treated increase the government control?
You're saying like you're thinking maybe regular old ISP is already compliant. Like they're not necessarily throttling some bandwidth. They're not necessarily doing weird schemes to give people fast lanes. So how would they be affected at all? I think that's your question. Am I right?
Yes, exactly.
So the internet kind of isn't like this kind of monolithic where you connect to it and then it connects you to the website. It's actually more of a web, and I'm sure you've heard that before.
It's a series of
Things are
tubes.
connected. It's a series that I think that someone told. I won't digress. I'll say that the internet is very decentralized. So when you send out information, when people bring up this fast lane analogy when it
Yeah.
comes to net neutrality, roads actually are a pretty good analogy for how the internet works. The speed at which you can get from your source to your destination, obviously it's very dependent upon how many roadblocks are being put up on your way to and from your destination. But the thing that's even more important to how fast you get where you're going is the topology of the city, the way that everything is connected. And when it comes to treating, like, for example, let's say you're in a place where the only road from your house to Netflix is via a winding dirt road. Um, and
Uh,
someone else is living in a house where the way to get there like is just straight onto an on ramp onto a highway and then directly into Netflix. You could have those two people say, "Hey, how come when I live in this area, you make Netflix slow?" And the answer could be that's just kind of how the topology of the network is. So people don't understand how intrusive it is to say that you must treat all traffic equally. You can say unintrusively, don't put deliberate roadblocks up. And even then, that's kind of tricky because what counts as a deliberate roadblock? If you just don't maintain that dirt road, is that a deliberate roadblock?
right, right.
Um, and then on top of that, the real motivation for all of this is that the ISPs, everyone knows that they're in this position where, like South Park made fun of it, where they just have little flaps on their shirts that they can rip open at any time so they can rub their nipples at the thought of exploiting the customer. But it is well known that they exploit their monopoly position, and the internet providers like Netflix and Google are in the same position as us. They're being exploited too. Those dirt roads that connect, say, Cogent, let's pretend we're American, to Netflix, those dirt roads that are ill maintained really do obstruct Netflix's business, and there's not a damn thing they can do about it. And this is actually the motivation that people don't realize is what's behind this net neutrality stuff. They want to have regulatory power so that they have something to hold over the ISPs in return to say, aha, you've been trying to give us crappy service, but we've decided that we're gonna cause all sorts of grief for you, and we're essentially going to extort a really primo nice road between all these customers and us, and you're not going to be able to charge us a dime for it, and we're all going to do this all under net neutrality. like
Right.
like
And
you're saying, they don't understand that this is actually a huge cost. We're talking about stringing new wires in the name of equal service.
right. And I know that, like when I asked the question, I know that a company like Netflix has incentive to, if they can offload the cost of their bandwidth to someone else, then it's in their interest to do so. So that part, like I really like the road metaphor, and I think that's what's sticking in my head the most. So if you can, have asphalt to cover this dirt road, it's in their incentive to have someone else pay for it. And if I
So,
understand, yeah, go on, go on.
well, so okay, maybe I'll just kind of go into full education mode. Essentially, the ISPs, both on the Netflix side and the consumer side, they control how packets are routed that they send out. They don't control the ones that come in, which makes sense. It's like a courier service. You don't pick the route for the packages that come to your door, but you can pick basically the route for the ones that leave you. Um, More or less, neither side wants to pick the route that's going to go out to the big cross-country providers. There are actually third-party providers that connect all of the major cities together, and they're essentially the kind of the super highways in the road analogy, and they charge tolls. It is expensive. So what they'll do is they'll kind of connect directly to each other. So what'll happen is Netflix will put actually pieces of their network, possibly even their entire video library, in every major city that they can afford. And when you connect to your ISP, it'll just kind of bypass that superhighway and just go straight into Netflix. Now, this
Right.
connection between Netflix and the ISPs, and I'm sorry if I'm digressing too much, but this connection between Netflix and the ISPs is a mutual thing. It's called peering because they're peers, that neither of them is higher in the hierarchy than the other. This mutual connection is kind of negotiated, where if Netflix wants to, they can try to obstruct the ISP's ability to access their website
And vice
by
versa.
not giving good service, and vice versa.
Right.
And we've found situations where both sides are trying to use regulatory pressure to alter this arrangement, where one side has a leg up over the other, one side has to pay more. And net neutrality is the Netflix and Google side of things. It's the provider side, and the ISPs are opposing it because it's against their interest. And in no interpretation is this all in the interest of the consumer. So the providers, they've come up with nightmare scenarios of the worst things that they could imagine from coming out of a lack of net neutrality, and they've pumped that out into the public in an effort to scare everyone into thinking that the sky is falling. And yeah, it might be a bit exaggerated.
Right. And I I think I get it. Again, I think this road metaphor of yours is what I'm gonna go with. I think that
Yeah.
like it makes sense for UPS to have paved roads with asphalt everywhere. But the road maintenance companies who are regional, if they have to pay for it, that's kind of how net neutrality, which would kind of force all roads to have a certain amount of lanes and asphalt on them, would hinder those small ASPs. Am I simplifying that too much? Well, probably, but how close to the goal am I?
It's not bad. It's both extremely complicated and at the same time. Roads are a good analogy. Another good analogy is so if there's a lineup to get on the highway, it is possible to have them charge you to jump the line, to go to the front of it and then get on the highway first. This is one of the things that net neutrality would outlaw, sort of. And this is actually something that, sorry if I'm taking you off your plan, but I really want to clear up for people, is that
Please.
a fast lane, just like a road, only helps you if the road is full. So if it's during rush hour and there's traffic in every single lane, the lane that's restrictive and costs more money, that lane will help you. But any other time, if it's not rush hour, it doesn't matter what lane you go in because they're all going at the same speed because the road's not full.
Right, right.
So when people talk about fast lanes, it's true that fast lanes could potentially be provided, but they would only ever help you at the most peak hours, not just of the day, but of the year. So essentially, it wouldn't help you at all. It'd be extremely rare where it would help you. What people are talking about when it comes to fast lanes are actually slow lanes. They're talking about charging people not to be in the crippled, blocked lanes.
Right, right, right. I think that you probably covered most of this, but I really want to get back into how net neutrality would hinder a small mom and pop ISP. Um, if you haven't already, and it flew over my head, how would such a concept as net neutrality hinder this mom and pop ISP? Is it beyond like regulation and having to have like a higher floor of IT equipment that you would have on your to provide in your network?
Let's go back to the road analogy. So we have a tiny little city, little mom and pop town. It has a small number of roads, which in this analogy are the links between various places in, say, the province or whatever state that they're in. If one of the roads is slower than the other, which is bound to happen, or one of the roads is more congested than the other, or even if there's just some random complaint, maybe there is no problem and just your competitors just wants to screw you, they could say, hey, we've detected what we believe is a violation of your neutrality. We want to inspect these roads. So I'm not sure, because I haven't been in the industry for a while. I'm not sure how often this happens, how often there is a challenge to how the network is configured, and how often a regulatory body has to intervene. I'd be interested to hear from some of my former colleagues about how hard net neutrality has hit us, because if our listeners here don't know, it is the law in Canada and still is. But just that is costly. It's costly for engineers like me who are paid a great deal of money, not to brag.
Yeah, you make engineer money.
Yeah, but we're now spending a portion of our day talking to regulators and educating people and explaining this is why we set the network up that way. And the worst case would be if they disagree with us, perhaps because they have reason to disagree, or perhaps simply because bureaucrats tend to be laymen and just don't get it. Then they may have power to enjoin the company to alter its network, which, let me tell you, is an expensive proposition. These
Yeah, I
fiber
can
optic
imagine.
lines, they don't land in the ground for free, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, does that explain how a mom and pop business might be threatened by this sort of thing? Like, I mean, not destroy them instantly, but you can see how this sort of thing would be damaging in potentially.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of the basics were covered already up to this point, but I hadn't factored in the last time of just speaking to regulators who suspect that they might. We suspect a violation of net neutrality on your part. I can see how a company, a big company could handle that no problem. They probably have an entire team dedicated to speaking to regulators and shit like that. But a
I can give you
small mom
another
and
example too.
yeah, go.
For example, let's say that Netflix, drunk on power, has gotten all this passed, or not to single out Netflix, Google wanted, a whole bunch of companies, and they decide that they want to reach your customers with greater speed. Now, that connection that they have between your network and theirs, like I said, it's a mutual thing. They're peers, but both sides, the equipment plugged in physically to both sides has to be fast enough to handle the connection speed, which potentially means that if they want to upgrade, you have to upgrade too. Now, let's say that you're a mom and pop business and you can't afford to upgrade. You just kind of have to say, I'm sorry, but our customers are going to have to get Netflix a little bit slower than other ISPs because we just can't. We don't make enough money. Sorry. They could
Okay.
potentially turn around and lodge a complaint and force you to upgrade your equipment, which will put you out of business.
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, in the situation where one of these big content providers or traffic sources, because I would say that Google doesn't really uh, provide content. I'm talking about Google proper, not their like YouTube, which we're on right now.
So it all goes through the same network.
Yeah, exactly. So if one of these big companies decided to raise the standards of their network, the mom and pop place with their old shit would be subject to all the situations that we talked about up to now, and potentially be out of business right there.
Yeah, It's the connection between their network. So the providers like Google are ISPs as well. They're just ISPs that send more than they receive. So when two ISPs connect, one on the receiving side and one on the sending side, and vice versa, we're just talking about just the relationship between those two networks. So we're not talking about them per se upgrading their network and then trying to drag all the ISPs along. We're just talking about just that one connection between the two networks. And if Google says, hey, how come everybody from a mom and pop ISP co incorporated, how come it's always so slow for them? And then they go and they look and they say, oh, this guy's link is saturated, which is kind of a no-no, by the way. We try to avoid saturated links, but hey, if you can't afford it, you can't afford it. And so they could go and they could say, hey, we want to upgrade this. And then the ISP could turn around and say, listen, you cover half the cost and we'll do it because this is bad for you. It's bad for us, but we can't afford it. The response could be, sorry, we're going to make you, we're going to give you this cost. And if you don't like it, then take it up with the CRTC. You see how that could go?
Right. Yeah, I get it. And I think this segues nicely into a topic that I wanted to talk about, which is which probably goes beyond net neutrality, but probably implies a lot of the factors that you mentioned so far, which is and I think this is a pretty safe bet. Why would you say that telecom companies in general, I'm pretty sure no matter where you are in the first world, as far as the field of telecom is concerned, is just an oligopoly. There's like three at most big providers, and that's about it. What would you say are the factors that lead to that phenomena?
You said that you're a legalese kind of guy. You like diving into the laws. Maybe you can help me here because there's something that I knew with certainty working directly with lobbyists is that telephone companies and cable companies have an enforced monopoly. In other words, you're not legally allowed to compete. And they have what they call territories. There are certain areas of land where there is one telephone company and one cable company. And I'm interested to hear exactly how they enforce this. I'm pretty sure if you look, you'll probably find that it is explicit that if it's your territory, that this is the particular company that will operate in that territory.
What makes it difficult for me to relate to that question is that here in Quebec, anyway, that is not the case, or at least not where I live. Oh, it is?
No, yeah. So in Ontario and Quebec, and there's only one cable company and there's only one phone company, and they are forced by regulation to their lines to competitors. So
I think I understand what you mean, and I think that I also understand what gave me the impression that it's not the case. Here in Quebec specifically, I'm thinking about Bell Canada and Videotron. Videotron, as far as telecom is concerned, those are the two only names in the game. When we throw in cell phones, then there are a couple other players like Rogers and shit like that. But now that I think of it, Videotron was a cable company initially, and Bell Canada, well, it's Bell, it's phones. So now that I think about it, I'm guessing that, because I know Videotron, the way that they provide phone services is VoIP. So they're basically their own ISP, and they can provide phone services through their own cable network. And Bell, technically, they do satellite TV. So that's, wow. My mind is blown right now.
Yeah, so we had to, working for the small ISP, we actually were one of the few holdouts. So I'll kind of go into the history of it. Back in around 1915, there was one big company that covered everything. And that was, I forget what they're called at the time, it was either Bell or AT&T. But it was essentially kind of a de facto monopoly. And essentially, your usefulness of a telephone company depends not necessarily on how well they deliver the telephone to your home, but more to how many other telephones are on their network that you can talk to. So this is what economists call a network effect, where it actually lends itself toward one big company handling it all, because that's how you get the most effectiveness out of it. So this is kind of the natural state of affairs. We had one big company, and the government kind of in the States wanted to step in. The Department of Justice wanted to step in and take antitrust law against them. So it wanted to split them up, and most people have probably heard of the great split up of AT&T and the baby bells and such. I'm sure that Canada has a similar history, or maybe Bell Canada is one of the baby bells. I'm not entirely sure about that, but essentially there was a deal that was struck at that time, and the deal was no, the split up happened in the 80s, I think. The 1915 one, actually, the deal that was struck was that they would the government would endorse the monopoly. Right. Yeah. Back in, say, 1918 or something, they would endorse the monopoly, and they would give them power to be the one provider of telephones for like the whole country. And in exchange for this, as part of their deal in the antitrust suit, they would agree to certain conditions. And these conditions are very similar to what we're hearing about nowadays with net neutrality. The condition was that no matter where you are, no matter who you are in the entire country, you would get telephone service. And that means that if you live on an island in the middle of a lake and there are no roads to it, and you literally have to take a boat to get to your house, you pay the exact same amount to get your phone service there, even if they have to do like a $250,000 project to get that phone service out to that stupid little island. You pay the exact same monthly rate, and you can just cancel the next month if you wanted to. As everybody else.
That's not funny. Oh, man.
But this is the law in Canada right now. What they're called is incumbent local exchange carriers, or ILECs, and Bell Canada and such are one of these telephone companies. And cable is a similar situation. I'm not sure how it differs, because, like I said, I'm not really on the legal side. I'm more on the network side. So all of this I'm hearing secondhand from lobbyists that I had to work with. But essentially, this kind of relationship it exists all the way to today. There's a legally enforced monopoly, and in exchange for this monopoly power, they have certain conditions upon them. And the conditions include things like they have to charge everyone equally. They have to allow competitors to use their network, which is why people are under the false impression that there's more than one phone company or cable company in their area. And they have to do all sorts of various things, like they have to negotiate essentially with regulators every time they want to change a price for their product, and all the prices have to be the same, and it's
I know
complicated.
I can imagine. So, and you go first.
The 1980s-ish one was when they decided to kind of do away with this situation and actually to split them up. So back in the 1915 or whatever, they had a government enforced monopoly across the whole country, and then later on they decided that they were going to actually split these companies up into smaller ones. The split up has kind of been undone since, because each one of the split companies still maintained that monopoly privilege. They just maintained it over their specific areas. They started to conglomerate again as they started to buy each other up. They still maintained that monopoly privilege, and now we're just kind of basically back in the same situation that we were before. We have a very small number of extremely powerful companies that control everything, but the government says that we're going to enforce quote-unquote competition by forcing them to lease their lines at rates that are regulatorily decided to competition. Now, when I worked for my company, I worked on both sides. We were a small ILEC, one of the few holdouts that never did merge together with a company like Bell Canada. So we had this monopoly power, but it was out in a rural area. It was very small. It was largely just over a certain tiny number of subscribers. But we did want to do business into the major towns like Kitchener, Waterloo, Toronto, London. So we had to be competitive carriers with them. So I actually have seen both sides of this regulatory divide. So I've seen the both the incredible power and the incredible burden that the ILECs have to suffer, and I've seen what it's like for the competitive exchange carriers, the CLECs, and for them, when Bell Canada is compelled by law to sell you service, you can imagine the level of customer support that you get for that.
Yeah, totally. I mean,
it's not good.
Yeah, I remember.
Like, imagine if you were compelled by law to sell something to somebody and you didn't want to. You'd rather be a monopoly. Imagine the level of customer service you give that guy if he called you in the middle of the night and he said that, hey, half my customers are down. Well, how would you feel about that? I bet you wouldn't be happy. I bet you wouldn't be happy that there's some government thug at your door trying to force you to sell to this guy, and now he's calling you up with complaints. This is exactly the sort of service that we got. Customers would go down and they'd be like, okay, we'll fix it in a week or less. 7 days later, we got a reply saying, looks fine to me. And then we say, no, it's clearly not fixed. And then they'll say, okay, we'll fix it in 7 days or less.
Wow.
And then that cycle would continue. Yeah, and you would get them.
I could imagine how it would it would set up that kind of passive aggressive customer service where you don't really want to do business with this person, and the customer service is kind of shitty at times, and to do customer service for someone that you didn't really want as a customer period would be that much more vexing for the provider.
And we actually have a vested interest. I shouldn't say we. I've been working there for years. They had a vested interest in maintaining this misconception that there are many, many ISPs and not just one cable and one phone, because it gives them the impression, gives customers the impression that if they don't like their phone company, they can just switch to another DSL provider. This is they're not switching to another DSL provider. The lines that connect from their house to the data center are still owned by the company that they hated and they were dying to leave. So when we have situations like I was just describing, where the customer support was just getting looped around and they started getting mad at us saying, why does your internet suck? I should just go back to Bell Canada. We kind of have to grit our teeth and say, it is Bell Canada that's causing this problem. And then they go, what? Wait, so when I switched from Bell Canada to you, I didn't really switch? And then we'll say, well, after it gets into the data center, then it takes a different path and it goes through us instead of them. And then they'll say, wait, but the actual connection that's coming into my house is exactly the same. And it sucks just as bad. It's giving me exact same heartache. And there's no difference. And then we have to admit them, yes. And then they cancel and they go to cable. Right?
Yeah. And I can imagine that even if they did go back to Bell, at least from a customer service standpoint, it would really be Bell's client instead of Bell's client's client. So
yeah. They're collecting money too on all these third-party connections too. So even they would rather that the customer be a direct Bell Canada customer, but they're still kind of happy even if they're not, because they still get to collect. So essentially they are in this regulatory position where they can just print money.
Right.
And this is actually so.
You go finish your thought.
There's a bit of a delay there. This is what the takeaway that I want people to have when they listen to this. The real problem is that there are enforced regulatory monopolies. And maybe I haven't actually looked up the laws. Like I said, maybe it's not a strictly enforced monopoly. Maybe things like Google Fiber could weasel their way into certain markets. But they're not a cable or a phone company, though, so they can kind of use different regulations. Anyway, but they still have, even if it's not explicit, it's an implicit de facto monopoly that's caused by the government. They are muscling out competition gruesomely. Like, you cannot become a competing customer. They have their territory. And this is what has caused customers to look at the shenanigans that their ISPs have pulled, and they're opening up their nipple flaps and they're starting rubbing. they're looking at this and going, this is a failure of the free market. This is the market has caused this issue. But no, there would be much more competition if it was legal. It is not legal. And this is the real problem that people should be looking at, rather than trying to introduce additional regulations to try and rein in some of their crooked behavior.
And if I wanted to start my own ISP provider, I would have to choose basically if I wanted my infrastructure to rest on DSL or on cable, and choose which monopoly that I would approach to have them sell me their services. Am I getting that right?
But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can be a competitive carrier on both cable and cell phone. That's what we were too.
Okay, cool.
Actually, no, we were just phone, but we could have been cable as well.
Right. I would like to, I didn't have any questions with regards to this, but I want to use this to transition. I was watching a YouTube video, and the person speaking kind of went on a rant on net neutrality, and he kind of put his finger on an issue that I didn't have in mind when I recorded my last video, which is the issue of consumer protection. I think that it's a very valuable thing. I think that we both acknowledge how if I want to sell you something and you want to buy, at first there is a conflict of interest. I want to sell high, you want to buy low, and if I have, let's say, a car that I want to sell you, and I convince you on how it's the best car ever, and the car kind of breaks down when you get home or whatever.
That's fraud.
Okay, yeah, that is fraud. Actually, yeah, it's not a good example. But
well, it's fraud when the ISPs do it too. Actually, right? Like if they sold you a connection, and they said, we're going to give you blah, blah, blah megabits, and nowhere in their fine print do they tell you, oh, yeah, unless you're torrenting or unless you're watching Netflix. If they don't tell you that, and then they sell it to you, and then you find out that they're actually not supplying you with the amount of speed that they promised, and bearing in mind that, like I said, it is complicated, depending on the topology of the network, that might just be the speed that the network has. It might not be that they're obstructing it. But if they are obstructing it, that's fraud. It should be treated as fraud. And in fact, I think it is, both in the United States under the DOJ and such, or Department of Commerce or something. There's a Trade Commission, is it? There's some regulatory body that goes and looks around for this kind of shenanigans, and they'll come after them. And this actually doesn't require net neutrality. Net neutrality cannot exist, could never have existed, and we still could have gone after ISPs who provided you with fast lanes without explicitly getting you to sign up for that sort of thing. And let's just say I've heard of companies that have throttled torrents. I'm not going to point any fingers, without disclosing it to their customers. And if I may or may not have worked at a company like that, I would have potentially felt extremely conflicted about it and have felt that it was fraud. It was totally a fraudulent act.
And I think there's, I think the goal of consumer protection, or at least one of them, is to protect people from fraud. So yeah, I might not have thought up my example of the car that breaks down when you get home correctly. However, the issue of, if I can get your money through shady means and I don't have any scruples, then I have incentive to act on that desire. And if I can get away with it, then great. However, you're the sucker in that. And the idea of protecting you from people like me in this scenario is very valid, and I can kind of relate to people who have those concerns. I think they're valid concerns. Like I was scared. I was scared with the fucking machine you mentioned at the beginning there, that kind of at the hardware level can detect the different kinds of traffic, and you could set up some business rules that would treat them differently depending on it. That is, yeah, basically Yeah, like as much as oligopolies suck, monopolies are even worse. And like I was telling a friend of mine in a discussion, I think that the idea of having a coercive monopoly in charge of consumer protection is kind of not ideal. Let's say it that way.
I'll say that the cause of this exploitation, where they'll give you crap service and they'll overcharge for it, is the excess of regulation. Like I said, it is literally illegal to compete with them. So people mistake this for a natural product of the system. They mistake it for this is just how internet happens. This is how it would have happened, no matter how many times you went back in time and rolled the dice. This is just a fact of nature, and there's nothing we can do except to have intrusive regulation to take their bad behavior and simply outlaw it. But I would say that what we really need is competition. And in fact, you'll notice in places where there is a lot of competition that you don't see a lot of these types of shenanigans.
Places like what?
Like, for example, if I want to buy a computer, there's a dozen places I can buy my
like
computer.
different fields. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
and you don't have a tendency to see a bunch of bloatware and such on your computer that's causing extremely intrusive things to you, at least not to the degree where you'll see them on say cell phones, where it is highly regulated. You have to pass regulatory scrutiny in order to release a cell phone. You'll see a lot more of that hideous bloatware and a lot more lockdown to prevent you from changing the way that it operates and such. This is just one example.
Right, and I thank you for bringing it back to I was aware of the enforced monopolies in telecom. I just completely forgot about it because I was interested in those things so long ago. However, I remember seeing old-timey black and white pictures of these telephone posts with like a huge amount of cables running through it. I think these were only electricity cables, but this was back before Hydro-Quebec took over hydroelectricity here. And I'm assuming that in in telecom, whether it's cable or telephone, there would be that concern of having like a whole bunch of wires everywhere because each company would have their own infrastructure and shit like that. Do you have any spitball ideas as to someone who brings up that objection, let's say at a bar?
Oh, well, I get this a lot, and actually, as an engineer of networks, I can explain various ways in which you can fit everyone's connections into one line if you want. So the question is, okay, if you let people put in more than one line, then isn't everybody going to do it? Aren't we going to have like people stringing 1,000 different pieces of copper from place to place? Well, and slightly as you've described, it's all underground now, or to a great extent underground in pipes. And also, it's expensive. It's very expensive to run your own kind of province-spanning network. So the incentive would be for there to be a system similar to what we have now, where the major companies have the big-ass network, and they kind of subsell. They lease out bits of their network to smaller competitors. And they would probably do this voluntarily, because the alternative is that someone would string a new network and then you'd have two. And in the situation, once you've gotten up to two, then if one of them won't accept a third-party competitor, the other one probably will, because this screws not just their competitor, but it also bolsters their bottom line.
Yeah, totally.
And then, if they start to collude, there's a possibility of having three. But this is kind of a diminishing returns thing, where there comes a point where it starts. They just the threat that another line might get strung is enough to make them not want to do these shenanigans, because they know that competition is always just over the horizon, and if you push them just far enough, there's going to be new lines going up. And now, as an additional dissuasion from that sort of thing happening would be the municipalities control what goes on their poles and what goes under their ground and so forth. So we can still have some level of regulatory control over who strings up the lines. But I think it's about time that we allow at least some competition. This hard and fast rule of one area, one telephone line, one area, one cable line is what's causing all of this problem.
Right.
And I'm no fan of regulation, but if they had a soft hand with it and they just treated it like just landowners, and they're just saying, okay, if you come to us with a reasonable deal, we will rent out this space in the ground to you and we'll run your cables. A feeling that it would be impossible for it to get out of hand in the way that you described, not just because copper is an expensive metal, right? So
right.
Yeah. Also, we have right now, so I was talking about kind of in the road analogy, like the super highways that connect you from all the way from one side of the country to the other. It's a very expensive route to travel, but it'll get you the places that you're not directly connected to. These backbone connections, they are essentially, as far as I can tell, not regulated in the same way as phone and cable. It's essentially a Wild West for them. In fact, if you really wanted to, you can just take the basement of your office complex and connect it to the basement of another office complex. It would be expensive to run that stuff, but you actually do occasionally see companies doing it. And in fact, this is how you make an ISP: is you links from the haul over great distances, and you contact like the electrical company or whoever has the authority to put cables in the ground, and you just do it. It's kind of unregulated.
You ask them to do it for you.
So if you have the assumption that if it's unregulated, you'll have a rat's nest of cables, that's kind of refuted by reality. We have a largely, as far as I can tell, and someone can correct me if I'm not true, but it's a largely unregulated telecommunications industry as far as these high capacity backbones are concerned. And there's no giant rat nests of cables. There's no 50 ISPs trying to get into my basement. It's just is what it is.
Right. And just the fact that you're not a monopoly, in the context where you're not a monopoly, it wouldn't make much business sense for you to set up, to pay the huge cost of setting up an infrastructure just to engage in potentially shady dealings that would drive customers away. Or at least if you did, let's say you had really no scruples, then you better have a fucking solid plan for when you're found out, for what you would do in regard to that, because you're basically done if that were to happen.
And I have actually seen this. It's not hypothetical. With these huge backbone connections, if one of them starts giving you bad service, you can move your traffic to the other one, and they won't like that. And indeed, you do actually have two physical separate connections coming into your data center, just as you would potentially have two physically separate connections going into your home for your cable, for two different cable providers. So I've experienced what it's like to be a telecommunications customer where there's two separate lines coming into my, in this case, data center, where I can just flip traffic back and forth between them depending on which ones piss me off or piss management off.
Yeah.
This is a system that works. They are quite afraid to mess with me. They never pull down the nipple flaps on their uniforms and start rubbing and going, "Oh, it's too bad you can't go to the competitor because there isn't one. Oh, right. That sucks for you." Yeah. So yeah, I can say that, like, to me, it's kind of alien thinking about this idea that we need to have exactly one cable and one telephone provider per area, or else we would have these old black and white photos where there's a giant rat's nest coming from, or it'd be like some third world slum in South America where you actually have children climbing the telephone cables and plugging in however and whatever they want just to get access, just to hook into the network. That's yeah, this is just kind of a knee-jerk response. It's just kind of like, I like the idea of regulation. Therefore, this whole idea of more competitors scares me. So I'm going to come up with this nightmare scenario that everywhere is going to have cables everywhere. They're going to come bursting out of the ground as I try to walk down the street. But it's really, just speaking of someone from experience, it's just not going to happen. There will be a strong incentive for them to share their connections so that they don't have to take expensive copper and string more.
Cool. Well, I was hoping to end on the nipple flaps, but I think on my end we've covered basically everything that I had written down here. So, do you have any closing thoughts or things that you really want to make sure that people who have watched this take home with them?
I say that whether or not net neutrality succeeds or fails, whether you're happy with that or not, the battle's not over. So we need to move. I would love to see the same amount of enthusiasm against the laws that are the regulatory laws that enforce monopolies that we had against the repeal of net neutrality in the States. I'm enthusiasm trying to make it so that we can compete. Like, for example, in support of Google Fiber, who is in regulatory hell right now, getting like legally challenged and trying to get ousted from their attempts to introduce competition. If there was as much energy behind trying to make sure that didn't happen, much better change in the future. And I think that we should consider that. We shouldn't just rest on our laurels in Canada now that we have net neutrality. Oh, I guess that all the exploitation is going to stop. No. Keep it going. Keep that truck going. And turn it in the right direction. Turn it toward the regulation that's causing the problems.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. I'll start with my spiel and then end with yours. So thank you very much for watching. Please like and share. Leave your comments below. This is an important conversation, as I think everyone is aware of. It goes to the backbone of how the internet works, and we're on the internet having it. So let's duke it out peacefully. Again, I will remind you that Daniel can be found at libertybeat.ca. And he also has a YouTube channel. Please subscribe to that and mine. Hit the bells to get notifications. And thank you very much for taking the time, Daniel.
Great. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Excellent.